This is C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. This week, former U.S. Capitol Police Chief Steven Sund discusses his book, Courage Under Fire. He provides his personal account of the events leading up to the January 6, 2021 riot at the Capitol. He's interviewed by New York Times congressional reporter Luke Broadwater.
Chief Sund, thanks for being with us. You're the author of a new book, Courage Under Fire. I read the book. I think it's very well written, and it's an important contribution to what's a growing sort of volumes of evidence about what happened on January 6th, 2021. So thanks for being here. Before we get started, could you tell us a little bit about your background, where you come from, how you got into law enforcement, and how you ended up the chief of the Capitol Police on January 6th?
Absolutely, and thank you very much for having me here today. I actually come from Southern California. I come from a military family. My dad was a B-52 pilot and got transferred out to Washington, D.C. When I was the young age of probably about 7.5, and grew up out in Northern Virginia. I had a close family friend from California that ended up going into law enforcement. She came out to visit one day and had married a sergeant with the Fremont Police Department, and I looked at him and said, I think I want to know what I want to do. And started following my dream at that point. I joined the Metropolitan Police Department, where I was there for 25 and a half years. Rose up through the ranks to the commander of their Special Operation Division, which is their elite. It's the bomb squad, the helicopter, the harbor, the presidential escorts, the major events. The elite division comes with a lot of responsibility. So there I did a lot of the major events in Washington, D.C., got to know all the partner agencies, Capitol Police, Secret Service, Park Police, everybody. And then in September of 2016, I was out at IACP September, October, and ran into some of the sergeant-at-arms that were out there, and they told me they were doing a search for the assistant chief of police for Capitol Police and asked if I'd apply. I applied on January 7th. I started in 2017, started as their assistant chief.
And you write in the book that your perspective to recounting these events is apolitical. Mm-hmm. We've heard a lot from Democrats about January 6th. Mm-hmm. We've heard a lot from Republicans. Why did you think it was important to emphasize that point right away for the readers?
I think it's important for a number of reasons. One, as a police chief or a police officer, I think it's critical that we do our roles, we do our jobs in a very apolitical fashion. It doesn't matter who we're dealing with. It doesn't matter if we're on a traffic stop, a 911 call. It doesn't matter who that person is. We should treat them all the same. For me as a chief of police, especially up here on Capitol Hill, I try to run things as best apolitical as I could, and to tell a story that isn't shaded one way or another by politics, I think is important because, January 6th was a devastating day for my officers, a devastating day for America on the Hill. And my concern is it could happen again. And how are we going to learn if we look at it through a political lens? We got to look at it, apolitically. We need to learn from somebody that was there so we can actually try and prevent this from happening again in the future. So I don't think we're getting anywhere by shading it one political side or another. We got to look at the facts. And that's kind of how I wrote the book. Mm-hmm.
Why did you want to write a book? I mean, there's been a lot of police involved in that day. You obviously have a unique perspective. But writing a book is hard. It takes a lot of effort. Why did you want to do it?
I initially didn't. I initially did not want to write a book. I initially wanted to get out there. And people don't realize, right after January 6th, I'm not one to usually talk to the media much. I knew the information that was getting out wasn't correct about what happened that day. So I went to the media to try and get the truth out. I kept asking, are they going to have hearings? I finally heard they were going to have hearings. The Senate was going to have the first set of hearings, but they weren't going to call me. So I went and I actually went to the committee, one of the committees, and pleaded to actually testify. And I was the only one there in person. So I did everything I could coming up to starting the book to get the truth out. And I was seeing it wasn't getting out. And you're right, writing a book is tough. I tell people, especially this one, such a personal story, such a devastating story. It was hard as hell to write, and I wish I never had to write it. And it took a lot of time to write, but I think there's a lot of facts, a lot of information in there America needs to know about what happened that day.
You mentioned in the back room that originally the book was more than 800 pages, and you've cut it down substantially. What was the editing process like? How did you decide what to cut out?
I had some very good editors that I had a chance to work with. As I'm writing about everything. I'm trying to gather all the information. I'm putting it in there. So there's a lot of personal stories, a lot of different things about what happened, that day, following up, going in to testify, things like that. They were probably whittled down as it went through the process from the 700 pages down to the 500 down to where it is now, almost 400 pages, it's still substantial. The thing is, it's fact based. It's got lots of references. It's got numerous citations. So it's not just my interpretation. I'm trying to provide as much facts in there as possible, and that's what retained in there.
Mm-hmm. Now, one theme that I noticed as I was reading through the book is how much law enforcement on Capitol Hill is affected by politics. You write at one point that about dysfunction in the Capitol, and you use the acronym SNAFU. And you said that there were different points you brought up, things like members of Congress complaining about officers looking menacing when they would have their riot gear on. Tell me a little about what it was like to operate in a situation where you have 535 different bosses and politics. I mean, politics affects everything on the Hill. Can you expand a little bit for the listeners about that?
You're really in the heart. When you say it affects everything, you're in the heart of politics, because everyone thinks, hey, he's the chief of police. He's at the top of the pyramid. That's a little bit, take that pyramid, turn upside down. I have 3 politically appointed people that oversee me as the Capitol Police Board. And then I have 4 committees that oversee the Capitol Police Board and myself. And those are all politically appointed committees. And then you have the leadership. So it's all about politics. It's all about optics, which is sad because they want the Capitol grounds to look a certain way. Whether you agree there should be a fence, there shouldn't be a fence, that's all has to do with politics and the access to the people's house, the access to the Capitol grounds. And I do think in a perfect world, people should have access. Right now we're not working in a perfect world. But politics should not affect security. And that's what's happening up there. Too many people that are reporting to a political entity have their hands in security, and that isn't how you should run security.
So that's sort of the backdrop as we head into January 6th. I mean, you've got this very politicized environment affecting law enforcement. Then on the day of January 6th, I'd like you to run through your personal story. There's a whole chapter in the book about the minute-by-minute events that happened on January 6th and how your officers were outnumbered 58-1 that day.
Yeah, 58-1. That's a lengthy chapter. I believe it's about 88 pages. I've heard it described a couple different ways, but it's like a roller coaster ride. So I started off that day based on the intelligence I had, expecting another event very similar to the first 2 MAGA events. I deployed every resource I had available out on the Capitol grounds. Came into work, driving into work as I would. I always talked to my partner agencies, made a couple calls to Park Police, Metropolitan Police, just to check in, see how things were going, and drove up, parked, and went up into the command center and began the day looking, thinking, okay, everything's still looking the same, everything's going to be fine. Knew we were going to have big crowds, and we were watching the crowds handle the crowds walking around the Capitol and down at the ellipse, and they were sizable, but it was nothing that we hadn't seen before. And then we started dealing with things like we had a suspicious package over by the Supreme Court that turned out to be nothing, just turned out to be a guy with a trailer, a little handcart. But then we ran into the pipe bombs over at the RNC. That's when I started getting really concerned, because a couple of times we had groups of Proud Boys walking by, we were watching them. But when the pipe bomb hit, and then at 12:53 we got hit on our west front by the Maryland Avenue and Pennsylvania Avenue walkways, I knew things had changed. I felt like a bolt of electricity went through my body, and seeing how those people were fighting with the officers, everything changed at that point. And thank God for the Metropolitan Police Department, my contacts there. We immediately got some resources in, but we just saw the fighting continue, and it was just a progression. People think it was a quick breach of the Capitol. Think about it. 12:53 they started fighting my officers, and it wasn't until 2:11, 2:12 that they put that shield through one of the windows of the Capitol. 80 minutes. My men and women in uniform fought their behinds off to protect the Capitol, protect members of Congress, and that was harsh battling. That was battling. And to watch that happening, and then have to go through, the multiple requests for assistance, then have to fight to, get the 71-minute delay trying to get the National Guard to be approved, and then have to go and fight with the Pentagon to now, once it's approved, to finally get them to deploy, and then wait 3.5 hours for them to deploy. I felt like I was in a dream. I couldn't believe some of the things that I was being faced with was happening, especially as I just continued to watch, the officers pile in and the fighting that was occurring, and hearing about the injuries. It was devastating. It was absolutely devastating. But it progressed with me heading over to the Capitol, getting the calls from the Vice President, which I write about in the book, And this is all outlined, minute by minute in that January 6th chapter. And it was tough. And then to take it up through when we finally felt like right around 5 o'clock, I felt like the tide was turning. We were beginning to get control and getting people pushed out of the Capitol, starting to make a limited number of arrests. I felt like the tide was turning. And then to be able to inform leadership that we can get them back into their chambers by 7:30, I felt we had finally accomplished something. But I knew what I'd seen that day was going to change history forever. What
was the worst thing you remember?
I think just the all-out, the brutality of the fighting. I've testified to this a couple of times. It was the worst attack on law enforcement I've seen in my career. Just the brutality, and just to think that I was seeing people beaten with American flags, and some of the fighting that was going on. It was clear that some people in that crowd had come prepared. Some people had come with climbing gear, had coordinated an attack. But just to see that happen to my men and women was devastating to me.
Yeah, I mean, there were dozens and dozens of officers injured that day. Obviously, some people lost their lives later. 2 members of the force, Brian Sicknick and Officer Liebengood, died afterwards. What are your thoughts on Sicknick and Liebengood? How were you close with either of them?
I knew them both. I was much closer with Liebengood. Liebengood actually worked out the gym that I went to out in Fairfax, and every once in a while we'd meet and talk. We were both into cars, so we'd always share car stories. He raced rally races, and I did different type of racing. So we'd always share car stories. So I was absolutely I was floored when I heard that. I was devastated when I heard about Sicknick. At the same time, I was dealing with Brian's illness, and again late on the 6th, we had heard that he wasn't doing well, and when he passed away on the 7th, I had just been dealing with the stuff with the Speaker going on TV and calling for my resignation. So I just felt like everything was just happening at once, and then to deal with Howard Liebengood's suicide just 2 days later on Saturday the 9th, it was very, very tough. But it was tough on the department. The thing with me is this is a story, and Courage Under Fire is a title that really applies to the officers. How they were out there, they were fighting, and they were being vilified in the media right after this. They were being vilified by members of the Congress that they had sworn to protect. To see what they're going through and how it affected them was tough. And I write a very telling story about telling portion where I go down and have to address a roll call after Howard Liebengood, hearing of his suicide. It was one of the toughest things I've ever had to do in my life.
Wyndham Hotels and Resorts makes travel possible for all. Whether it's the long haulers looking for a great cup of coffee, a roomier rest for the on-a-whim road trippers, or a place to make summer memories with the whole family. No matter who you are, where you're going, or why, with 24 trusted brands to choose from like La Quinta, Days Inn, and Super 8, your Wyndham is waiting. Get the lowest price at WyndhamHotels.com. Restrictions apply. Visit website for more details.
Were you scared on January 6th?
Was I scared?
Yes.
I was scared as hell. I saw what was happening. I saw that as they were progressing, and I even listened in the book that, I said a prayer not for them to get into that Capitol, because every officer that's down there, every officer that wears the Capitol Police badge and the patch has sworn an oath to protect that building. We consider it the icon. There's a saying that, hey, if the dome's still standing, everything's okay. That day was the one day I was like, wow, the dome's really being affected. As the group got closer and closer, and the crowd got getting bigger and bigger. I mean, you got to understand, at one time we had 10,000 protesters on the West Front. 10,000. Imagine what that looks like. And I'm looking at it from the command center, where we have cameras that are facing down from on top of the group. It was incredible to watch that. And I try in my writing to relay what I was experiencing, but also what the officers in the field were experiencing. I've talked to hardened MPD officers that have been through, terrible street shootings, things like that. They told me they were very concerned they weren't going to make it home alive that day.
Yeah, that's very clear if you listen to some of the radio chatter. I mean, there's real terror in people's voices as they're talking about what they experienced. One thing I would like to turn to is the issue of the National Guard. This is probably one of the most hotly debated issues. And the way I see it, there are 2 questions at play here. One, why wasn't the Guard ready and at the Capitol already ahead of January 6th? And then 2, why did it take the Guard so long to respond. You've done a lot of research into this. You were there firsthand. What's your view on both of those questions?
I've done a lot of research into it. What's interesting is I've actually on previous occasion been asked to actually teach something that's called Defense Support for Civil Authorities by the military, which is interesting. So I know my topic and I know how this is supposed to be handled. So I want to make sure that the readers understand. On Capitol Hill, I face certain restrictions on pulling in additional resources. So Congress has passed laws that say I have to go and get approval to bring in additional resources in advance. So if we're planning an event, whether it's State of the Union, January 6th, I have to go to the board and I have to go to leadership to get approval to bring in federal resources. Even in a case of an emergency, I have to go and get approval from the Capitol Police Board to bring in federal resources. So we run into a problem with that leads into your question about the National Guard. I went and asked for the National Guard in advance on January 3rd because that's what I have to do by law. No other police chief in the country faces the restrictions I face in bringing in federal resources. Congress has passed laws preventing me from doing it, and people don't realize that. So I had to go and make the request. Both Sergeant at Arms, the chief law enforcement officers for the House and Senate, did not approve my request. So here I come into January 6th, not having the guard, and all I wanted was unarmed guard on my perimeter. Because I knew the perimeter, we were going to have large numbers of people, and that was where I felt was my biggest vulnerability if we were going to have any issues, not having people on the perimeter to prevent people from jumping the fences. So on the game day, we get attacked 12:53, 12:55, I make a call to MPD requesting support, 12:58, I make my first call to the Sergeant at Arms requesting approval for the National Guard, which I have to by law. 71 minutes later, I finally get approval. Then at 2:34, I find I have to now go and fight the National Guard, fight for it with the Pentagon. So I had to get on a call with the Pentagon and plea repeatedly for the support of the National Guard, only to find, unbeknownst, because people have to realize that when the police department runs out of resources and we're overwhelmed, when we dial 911, who do we call? We call the Department of Defense. We call the National Guard. They're our backstop in getting help. So I put out that call only to find out there was delay after delay after delay. And what I hadn't realized is just 2 days earlier, the Secretary of Defense had put out this memo restricting the resources that my men and women so greatly needed on January 6th for an attack that I now believe they knew was coming because they'd talked about it. They had talked about it in meetings. They were so concerned. They were talking about locking down the city. Yet he goes and puts these restrictions on the resources I needed and never tells anybody. Never tells the very people that are going to call 911. So at 2:34, I'm pleading for their assistance and have to wait till 5:44 p.m. for them to arrive on the scene. When, think about the absurdity. They're within 2 miles of the Capitol, over 150 of them with all their riot gear, and they won't even move to help my men and women. I respect the military. I come from a military family. The people in the field, those that are willing to tell the truth, I highly respect. The people that decided not to send them to help my men and women that we needed support badly, I can't even question why. I can't even understand why they didn't send the help I needed.
Yeah, in a recent transcript, General Walker said that he was ready to break orders and send the troops down to the Capitol and resign the next day. That's how bad it was. Why do you think they put those restrictions on the Guard?
What's interesting is they've come out and in their testimony, I know you've covered this very clearly and closely. They've said they did it because of the protests in 2020, what happened up by the White House. If that's the case, why not put them out right after that? Why not make them a permanent change? This is how we're going to change how we do defense support for civil authorities. They didn't. They put them in place for 2 specific days, January 5th and 6th, the very days that they expected violence to occur in the city. I don't know. I'm perplexed at why they would do that. And not only that, it left one recourse. It left the QRF, the Quick Reactionary Force. And then the very next day, the Secretary of the Army, McCarthy, restricted the General Walker's use of that. I'm dumbfounded that, one, they restricted it, but two, they had to be watching the same TV screens I was watching, the same TV screens the nation was watching of the Capitol being attacked. We had shots fired in the Capitol, and I was on the phone screaming, begging for assistance, and they wouldn't send anybody. And they had to be seeing it. So, I'm perplexed. I talk about it in the book about why I feel there very well could be a hesitation for it, but I'm still perplexed at why a military officer would prevent life and death support from coming to the aid of my officers.
One thing the January 6th committee said in their report is that there was a fear among some of the top brass at the military that Donald Trump wanted to use the Guard to protect him and his supporters as they marched to the Capitol, not to protect the Capitol, and they felt it would be misused. Do you agree with that conclusion?
I write about a form of that. I think there was a lot of people within the president's cabinet that believe that he may invoke the Insurrection Act. And I tie that into the concern about how intelligence was handled. I firmly believe the intelligence community handled intelligence on January 6th different than they have in previous events. But I do believe there was a concern for him possibly activating martial law and activating the military in support of his concerns. So I think that played a role in the reluctance to put the military anywhere near the Capitol.
But there was also, I think, a reluctance on the other side. I think you get to this a little in the book about when you were denied by the Sergeant-at-Arms to call for the Guard, and you write that he was very aware of the politics on the Hill and of members' concerns, especially the Speaker's office, about the optics of having this military presence there. Can you talk a little about that?
Absolutely. I think, when I first went to Mr. Irving, and I write about exactly the time, I think it was 9:24 on Sunday morning, and people are like, why would you see him on Sunday morning? It was the very first day of the 117th Congress, I think it was, when they swore him in. But I felt it was such an important ask that I'd go see him in person. So I went and I asked him, and his first concern was, the optics. When he says the term optics, and it's interesting because the military uses the term optics a lot. It's used way too much on the Hill, and I talk about how it affected me a couple of times in the book. But his first concern was for optics, and it was clear that concern was from the problems we had over 2020, the protests we had by the White House. And I talk about the protests and the impact that had on security. But Speaker Pelosi at one point came out and referenced federal troops on city streets as stormtroopers, the term. And I believe that Mr. Irving's concern for optics was in relation to Speaker Pelosi's concern for the look of stormtroopers being on Capitol grounds.
Mm-hmm. You write in or you've said that you believe information has been deliberately suppressed. Which information are you referring to?
Again, I think the intelligence community treated this information, the January 6th, differently. I've handled numerous events in Washington, D.C., States of the Union, inaugurations, IMF World Banks. And think about all the previous times we've had events with far lesser threat streams. Now, after January 6th, some of the threats that I've seen, and I referenced many of them in there, and only partial, was extremely concerning. I mean, there was people clearly calling for storming the Capitol, killing, members of politicians. And to see how it was watered down, I didn't, in the past, if the FBI felt they were seeing derogatory comments being made, significant ones online, they would have, pulled a conference call together of all the local police chiefs and say, hey, we're seeing this, and have the analysts talk about it, or work with DHS to put out a joint intelligence bulletin. That didn't happen. They didn't call an executive meeting. DHS didn't put out a bulletin. DHS didn't even put out a warning. And think about it. DHS is formed after 9/11 to connect the dots, to make sure we never miss a threat again to our national security like we did in 9/11. And here we are. There was lessons learned in 9/11 that applied to January 6th. And my concern is there's going to be lessons learned in January 6th that are going to apply sometime in the future if we don't learn a lesson. Mm-hmm. That's what I feel. I feel it was watered down, and whether it was purposely watered down so the president wouldn't say, hey, this is going to be bad, I'm going to go ahead and implement martial law, I don't know. I can only suspect, these people had to be seeing, all the red alarms going off everywhere. Why they didn't put it in paper, I don't know. Mm.
Yeah, in retrospect, it looks so clear when you look at all the evidence, all the messages and threats and all these message boards and warnings that were going out, and the fact that it appears people missed it. But you say you didn't miss it, that you were already concerned and you were calling for the Guard sometime before.
Okay, so the intelligence I had indicated that this was going to be very similar to the two previous MAGAs. I didn't have intelligence saying we're going to get an attack. Mm-hmm. You got to understand, I've done a lot of events in Washington, D.C. I've got experience. I've done training. I knew we were going to have a large number of people coming down to the Capitol. And when they say the target of the protesters is Congress, you're a congressional reporter. Every protest we have that comes down to the Capitol, why are they protesting? To get to Congress. They're all their targets is Congress. So, I didn't take that as, because it didn't indicate their violent, target is Congress. It said their target's Congress. Of course, they're protesting down there. So my big concern was the perimeter. We had a large perimeter around the Capitol building. unlike the previous two MAGA events, where we didn't have Congress in session, we had Congress in session this time. And that takes a lot of my staffing. There's significant staffing that goes into a joint session of Congress, especially when you have the vice president there. So I knew I'd lost some of those resources to go inside the building and handle the security inside. So it left my perimeter a little more vulnerable. So that's why I went. It wasn't because I knew there was going to be an attack or I suspected that there was what happened on January 6th was going to happen. It was from my training, my experience. I said, probably the area of biggest concern is going to be the perimeter. I'd like more, and I was looking for unarmed National Guard just to stay in the perimeter, just to make sure people didn't jump the metal perimeter barricades.
One thing a couple law enforcement analysts have told me, and I want to know if you agree with this, is that law enforcement was prepared for a small attack from, say, the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers, some of these extremist groups they had heard about. What they weren't prepared for was riling up of hundreds and hundreds of Trump supporters to join this assault on the Capitol. Do you agree with that analysis?
To a certain extent. When you say small attacks, I think small confrontations. We expected small confrontations. I had my maximum amount of CDU personnel that I could activate. I had all the resources I had less than lethal. I had people that were supposed to be in the hard gear, the turtle gear. So we were ready for that. No, I did not anticipate a large group being riled up like they were on January 6th, being fired up and sent down to the Capitol during such a crucial time. I think, like I said in the book, there was groups of people that I feel were coordinated. And I think those small groups activated a mob mentality, which is extremely dangerous, that affected that attack. So no, I don't think anyone anticipated the type of attack we saw.
In the book, you say Nancy Pelosi lied about you. Then you talk about what she said about you on TV and you watching it at home. Walk us through that scene. What was the lie, and why do you think she told it about you?
Why I don't know. So the lie is, and I write about it in the book about how I found out that she was getting ready to go on national TV and call for my resignation, and that was a tough time. But anyway, so going in and watching it, at first as she was holding the press conference, it seemed like she was delaying it. Then she began talking about doing an after-action report, and I was thinking, that's exactly what I do, because I had no intention of resigning. A press reporter had reached out shortly before that and said, "Are you going to resign?" I said, "Absolutely not. I'm going to see this through because I want to find out what happened. I want to find out why things went so badly wrong." But then she goes on TV and she talks about doing an after-action report. I think, okay, that's smart. And then she turns and after another question about, was this a security failure, she says she's calling for my resignation. And then she says, besides, he hasn't even called us since this occurred. I talked to her 3 times. I talked to her 3 times about very critical information. The first one being with the vice president on his phone, and I briefed her. And then she called me shortly after that, and then there was another call to leadership to brief them. To have her go on and paint me as a callous, disrespectful person, again, she put me in the same boat as everyone else is saying, oh, cops are racist, complicit, they're involved. I felt that wasn't, I didn't deserve that, and I felt the American people needed to know the truth. Why she did it, I have no idea.
Do you think you were made into a scapegoat?
Security on Capitol Hill is very interesting. As the chief of police, you always know that you're one bad event away from going out the door. I just wish she had taken more consideration about what really happened and what attempts I did try to make to protect her and the members of Congress before calling for my resignation.
You mentioned in the book that you had personal interactions with Mike Pence, and you know what Mike Pence was thinking in that moment. Can you talk a little bit about those interactions?
So I had a couple of phone calls with Vice President Pence. A couple of interesting things about him. We're in the middle, and when he first called, it was 3:30ish, 3:32, I believe. When he first got a call, and I had to step out of the command center to take the call because they had transferred the call into an outer office. When I took it, his first concern was, "How are you doing? How are you and your officers doing?" I was taken back by that. But anyway, he had made it clear he was not leaving. He was staying at the Capitol. He wanted to see this certification of the vote through, but he wanted me to come over as soon as possible to brief him, and I couldn't leave at that point. And I really felt bad, it's the Vice President of the United States, but I'm trying to help my men and women right now. So pushed it off. He called back again, had to push it off a second time, and then he called back, and finally that's when the tide started to turn after 5 o'clock, and I could go over and brief him. When I went over to talk to him again, he was very concerned. He was concerned about what the officers were going through. He was concerned about seeing this through. He was concerned about the position. You could tell he was concerned about the position he was put in. It was tough, but I could see he definitely wanted to just finish this certification.
Yeah, the mob got within 40 steps of Mike Pence. You wrote in the book that you often, during big events or different events, would join the officers in the field. Mm-hmm. You'd like to be there in the field. But you viewed that day that your role, the most important thing you could do, was try to get them help. Can you talk a little about those efforts trying to get more troops, more other agencies to the Capitol?
Absolutely.
To help your officers.
And you're right. I think any police leader will tell you it's important for your troops to see you, and that was something I always talked to fellow officials to get out there in the field and see it as much as possible. But once that hit, and you'll read in the book, I talk in the book how I actually reached out to MPD ahead of time because I've worked at MPD. I've written their events manuals many times. I've deployed their civil disturbance unit personnel many times, so I know how they do it. Luckily, I'd called ahead of time and asked them, is there a way? I spoke with Assistant Chief Carroll, can they put some resources on Constitution Avenue? Thank God he did, because I think without those resources, they would have breached the Capitol much quicker. So at 12:53, once the attack began, my first call was to Jeff Carroll at 12:55, Mike Stinger at 12:58, and then after that, it was a series of calls, dozens of calls to my partners in law enforcement, whether it's Tom Sullivan at Secret Service, Airport Authority, the various different agencies, Park Police. I was calling everybody. I had direct lines, and this is where relationships matter. Every single one of them was sending the cavalry. Gary Settles with Virginia State Police. Number of calls were going out, and people were sending resources my way. And again, people need to realize, by law, I cannot call in federal resources without the approval of the Capitol Police Board, even during an emergency, and they still hadn't given me that approval. But I was calling in everybody I could. I even reached out to FBI, ATF, Secret Service, and they were sending resources because my men and women needed whatever help they could get. And as the chief, I'm the only one that can call outside resources into support them. So that was what I was trying to do as quick as possible. But it was dozens of calls, one after another. I activated mutual aid through Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, pulling in every bit of assistance I can get. And it was the men and women in law enforcement that turned the tide and got the Capitol back.
Yeah, absolutely. I was there at the Capitol that day. I remember MPD showing up, and I remember Capitol Police and MPD clearing the Capitol, forcing the rioters back before a single person from the National Guard arrived. And, I think within that time, you had cops dragged down steps, beaten with flagpoles, and so valuable hours went by where it was the police who were clearing the Capitol.
Right. And those valuable hours are what concerns me the most, because if we had gotten the resources, if we had gotten resources from National Guard sooner, if the Capitol Police Board had made a decision quicker and we didn't have these restrictions and the National Guard responded like they're supposed to according to their own directives in an emergency request, we probably could have gotten control of that much quicker. And I share that with you because I love the men and women of the police department, of the Capitol Police, and to see what they went through that day is devastating.
It is. You say that no one involved in the plotting or planning of January 6th has been punished. Who do you think should be charged, should be held accountable beyond just the rioters who went in the building?
Well, you've got a number of rioters that are being charged. You have a number of the groups that are now getting conspiracy, sedition, conspiracy charges, things like that. Anyone that was involved in an outright plan to attack it, whether it's people that are associated with the administration, things like that, I think are culpable in this. I look at like President Trump that day. He's always touted as the law enforcement president, and I think a lot of law enforcement has supported him. But I find it concerning. He pulls the group together on the day we're having the certification, goes out there and gives a very inflammatory speech. He had a number of people that are giving inflammatory speeches, and then sends them up to the Capitol, and he's the commander-in-chief. And then goes back in the White House and can watch this while we're under attack and doesn't send resources our way or even calls to offer resources. I find concerning to have to wait as long as we did before he finally puts out a message saying, go home, we love you, go in peace. I find that concerning. I feel there's a lot of people that probably have some involvement.
Do you think that was a dereliction of duty?
I think when you think of his role as the president and the respect that everyone should have for that office, I don't think he tried to de-escalate the situation, and I don't think what he did was in the level of what should have been done for the President of the United States.
If President Trump wasn't making calls to address security, who was in charge?
Who was in charge
of getting resources to the Capitol? I know Vice President Pence was making calls. From your perspective that day, who did you think was actually doing things within the federal government to get you help?
So as far as any law enforcement assistance within the federal government, I was making a lot of those calls. I was talking with Dave Bowditch with FBI. I was talking with Sean Benedict with ATF. I was talking with Tom Sullivan with Secret Service. So the federal resources, as far as law enforcement, we were making those communications. The military is the big question. And the military, when you got to look at it, again, I have the most restrictions of any chief as far as calling the military of any chief across the country. In Washington, D.C., military is activated through the president, governors and all the other states, but the president in Washington, D.C. Now, he has delegated that authority to the Secretary of the Defense, who delegated the Secretary of Army. Now, who in that circle was preventing the resources from coming to me? Because allegedly they're all involved, and the Secretary of Defense wrote this letter, Secretary of Army restricted the QRF. They all seem to have their hands somehow in the pie that just created this. I can think of a couple key words, but created this just delay in getting resources to us. I don't know who one person, again, I'm not here. I don't want to point, individual fingers at who may be at fault, because we need to correct this in the future. It just was a disaster about how it played out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've read different accounts from different people about the same meeting, where people are telling completely different versions of events. One person said one thing, the other person says I didn't say it. Somebody says I was in the room, somebody says I wasn't. It's and you can attribute some of that to the fog of war. But what needs to be changed to have a more streamlined process to get the Guard or get resources during an emergency?
Yeah, some of those meetings I've heard some of the same, and I think it was maybe General McConville that had talked about the fog of friction, and that the Pentagon isn't a tactical command center. I think it was McConville that said that. The big issue there is they had taken it over as a tactical command center. Their directives says specifically General Walker should have had the authority immediately to send his National Guard to me, according to DOD directives, and I reference them in there, and people can look them up online. They took that authority away from them. We want to get back to it. Give the authority back. They should have just followed their directives. They should have followed their rules. Instead, everyone wanted to get their hands in the pot and have some involvement. Well, with that comes responsibility. So,
now you say in the book you met with 6 hours with the 6 hours with the January 6th committee during their investigation. I've yet to see that full transcript myself. I've read a lot of the transcripts. But you also said that you felt that the questions from the investigators, they seem to have their minds made up already. Mm-hmm. Can you walk us through that interview process for you and what you felt? We'll just go ahead and walk us through that interview process.
Absolutely. So they originally requested a 3-hour interview with me. Showed up, we had gotten into it, we went through the 3 hours fairly quickly. At that point they said they'd like a little bit more time. I doubled it, probably in excess of 6 hours once it was all said and done. But it was clear they weren't focusing on the intelligence issues we had. They were focusing on more of, you didn't push hard enough for the National Guard. You didn't, it was your fault about the intelligence. It was clear that I got the distinct impression with the line of questions that the line of questions that they're asking, that they weren't really looking for the truth. They maybe already had a narrative that they wanted to get to, and they weren't asking the hard questions that need to be asked to get to the actual truth to prevent this from happening again.
Who do you think they were protecting anyone?
I think they wanted to minimize any leadership role in security on the Hill. Mm-hmm. I got that distinct impression.
Do you have any evidence that when the call for the guard was rejected, that was due directly to a certain politician such as Nancy Pelosi?
So you're talking about like during the event?
Correct.
I think I've always suspected. I'm trying to think of some stuff, but I think in one of the recent transcripts, or I believe maybe there's a January 6th committee where Paul Irving says that he realized he didn't have to request the approval from the speaker or leadership to authorize me to bring in the National Guard, but he wanted to make sure that they were aware. Mm-hmm. So it's clear there was a delay to at least make sure they're aware. And you got to understand, he's very politically astute. He knows he's been able to make it through Republicans, Democrats, back and forth, and he does it by keeping his leadership happy. And he knows that if he had brought in the National Guard without telling him, I suspect he felt that he would have gotten lambasted. Mm-hmm. But I believe that's in the January 6th that came out where he said he waited and made sure that they were aware before he authorized them to come in.
Right. Do you believe that you deserve any blame?
So I write about it in the book. Like I said, this is a fact-based book. If I deserve a black eye, I get a black eye. And I get a black eye on a couple of things. There's things I wish I'd done better, things I wished I'd taken care of ahead of time. The operations plan for inside. We had a plan for outside. We had a plan for the protests. There should have been a plan for inside that, I should have made sure that was done. There's a number of things that I wish I'd done better that I talk about in the book. So this isn't just one-sided that I'm pointing fingers at everybody else in the true Washington, D.C. fashion. You always hear it.
Right.
Fingers that need to be pointed at me, I'm happy to point at me. And whatever it is that needs to be corrected, I just don't want to see this happen again.
What specifically could you have done better?
Like I said, hindsight is always tough because you always are hardest on yourself. I wish I'd pushed on January 3rd for the guard more, basing it on my experience. And I told them why I wanted on the perimeter, but that's just how it is. During the attack, afterwards I've heard about the officers concerned about, no one was addressing us on the radio. I'm in the command center now. I'm making phone call after phone call after phone call. That doesn't excuse me from the fact that I've been through many critical incidents. I've handled barricades. I've handled active shooters. I should have known that there's probably going to be a breakdown in communications and help mentor my two assistant chiefs. We're all part of the critical incident management team to help manage these events. But I should have helped them because everyone I think was in a state of shock of what they were seeing. I should have helped and made sure that the incidents were being managed better, that officers were getting communications in the field better. And that's the thing that I think bothers me the most because I care about the officers so much, just to think that they were calling out for help and no one was there to help them.
Yeah, that was one striking bit of evidence was the call that says, is there a plan? And there's no response.
Yeah, that same here. I read that. And I really do wish that I had been more involved in that. Mm-hmm. And I fault myself for that.
Mm-hmm. Going forward, how could a police force address such a situation that's so chaotic, that's devolving in front of everyone? We have policies and procedures in place that literally are supposed to talk about how the command center transitions into area command to manage this type of event. And you exercise those to a certain extent. Nobody expected what happened that day. No one expected thousands of people to attack the Capitol and breach the Capitol building. So I think, just the sense of shock that happened, I think you got to get in and do more exercises on that and just make sure that everyone really understands their role. And if things had gone the way they were supposed to with requesting the National Guard and I hadn't been distracted so much with that, I probably would have gone, been able to focus things a little bit more. But I think just planning and exercising your directives is probably going to do better. I've interviewed a lot of Capitol Hill police officers. I did a long piece last year about all the injuries and the trauma so many faced. And one thing that struck me was some of the officers I spoke with, one of them actually teared up when talking about you, that you had been a mentor to her and that the force was in a dark place after January 6th and that your resignation had made her feel even worse when you were forced to resign. What's your reaction to hearing that?
I'm touched by that. I do believe that I have a very good relationship with my workforce. I think before we started the interview, I told you I've even talked to some of them today, which is true. I have. It was devastating to see what they went through. I had worked really, really hard to develop a certain rapport with my officers. It's unique. It's not like any other police department out there. And to have them really enjoy what they do, to stay as vigilant as they can, that's all key to my job as an official, and to be developing a plan for moving the department forward. So I felt it was key for me to have that type of relationship with my officers, because the esprit de corps, if they're excited about their job and they're excited about their leadership, they're going to do a better job. But I think right at the height of the relationship I had built in that 18 months as chief, to have that happen, I heard that sentiment from many officers. So I feel bad for them. I want to see them do better. I want to see them get better. Tom Manger, the chief there, he's doing the best job he can. It's a tough job that he's in. I wish him luck.
How do you assess the current state of the Capitol Police? I mean, after January 6th, so many people resigned. So many people had almost like a depression was over the force after what had happened.
I think there's still probably a little bit of that shock, and you call it depression. Many are still demoralized by it. You still have many people thinking about leaving. You have what concerns me is, before it used to be, hey, I'm going to do 25, I'm going to do 30. Now officers tell me I'm 20 and out. As soon as I get my 20 and I can go, I'm out of here. It's going to take time to come around. There needs to be a real clear roadmap of developing the officers, developing their personal like for the job, and just a plan moving forward. When I came in as assistant chief, my first goal was to try and get equipment, and budget's always a problem. And I fought and I fought and I fought. And it wasn't until, as you read the book, September of 2020, that I was able to get money just to get everybody a helmet. Now look at them. They're flush with money. They've gotten almost a $250 million a year increase. Money will help, but the officers are feeling overworked, underappreciated, and undersupported.
Yeah, that's one. In some of the Inspector General reports, some of the findings that I found most striking were the officers who really wanted to get their riot gear and couldn't get it on. And so they were left sort of unprotected as this mob's beating them. And there's one scene where a bunch of the riot gear is on a bus and the bus is locked. What did you think reading that?
Terrible, because after the first two MAGA events, like any police department would, we've done it in After Action. After Action said, one, you got to have the people dressed out earlier. You got to have their gear near them. You wanted water near them, things like that. All things that we had already identified. And to now hear during this event that they didn't have their gear on, they weren't actually where they were supposed to be at the time we got hit, and that they had their gear separated from, I find it is devastating. That's just a failure on our part as leaders to not make sure that they had their stuff with them. I mean, we had After Actions. We had an official in charge of CDU that should have made sure everyone had their gear with them, was ready, prepared to go. And I think I contribute that to a lack of experience. Unlike Metropolitan Police, they're out there a lot doing civil disturbance. Capitol Police, we do it occasionally, and for the most part, it's oftentimes very compliant. Over 2020, we had a number of the Black Lives Matter protests up on the Hill. No use of force, no chemical munitions deployed. So it's just, I think, a different level of experience, and I'll contribute that to probably lack of experience on some parts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you think of the typical protest on Capitol Hill. It's some people who speak up in a meeting and have to be escorted out, or some people holding signs in front of the grass. It's nothing like we saw on January 6th.
Right, a lot of very compliant. Usually it's a coordinated arrest ahead of time, things like that. But needless to say, they can handle non-compliant. We just didn't expect that level of attack.
I want to ask you, I know you don't want to point fingers, but who do you blame for January 6th?
That's a very good question, because as I look at it and as we talked a little bit, I find fault in the fact that the president brought a group down and continued. I'm waiting for all the cracking of evidence on the. I'm trying to think. They called it release the Kraken of evidence that they had on the stolen election. He's bringing down these people. He's firing them up, and he's sending them up to the Capitol, and doesn't provide any support. So I find fault there. But I look at how America is right now, and I've never seen a more divided country in my life. Everything has to be based on politics, on lines of, whether you're Republican to Democrat. And you find that from school boards to communities to councils. And I look back at that, and I fault all politicians for that. Because whether it's, tearing up the president's State of the Union speech, or Trump going on a Twitter rant, or the vice president saying, hey, we got to have these protests, these violent protests that are going to continue, and they'll continue after the election. We got to realize words matter. And people are looking to politicians to try and begin to heal America, and we're not in a good place right now. So I think on the day of, I think the president riled up a group and sent them up to the Capitol, and I wish he hadn't done that. But when I look at a bigger picture, I think we got a lot bigger involvement.
Right. We have many people say that was sort of the culmination they've been building, as a sort of a tinderbox that all it needed was a match to be lit to set people off. Even just this week, listening to members of Congress with their going away speeches, or last week, almost all of them were saying, we need to change this place. We need to stop being at each other's throats, encouraging our followers to hate each other. And you write in the book about the rising threats that preceded January 6th and continue to this day. What's the environment like now as a police chief or a former police chief trying to keep people safe in this environment?
I think it's tough across the country. I mean, you're seeing the rhetoric, and it's violent rhetoric on both sides increasing. It's nice to hear that they're talking about it. It takes one or two to start that. If they can start reaching across the aisle like, true statesmen used to do, I think it'll begin to set a different tone for the country. And that's what I think we really need to do. We're not seeing that right now. And people are going to mimic their political leaders. Be a leader. If you really mean it, make it happen.
I wanted to ask you, what lessons can we learn from January 6th as we sort of come to an end here? There's probably different categories of lessons to learn. Why don't we start with law enforcement failures? What lessons can be learned in that specific category to prevent something like January 6th from happening again?
So I go back to when we kind of talked about, and when you say law enforcement, I want to include the intelligence community in that, because they play a big role on how we respond. Because people need to realize law enforcement agencies plan based on the intelligence and information they have. You have inaccurate, incomplete intelligence, your plan is going to be inaccurate and incomplete. So I think first and foremost, everyone thought we learned our lesson after 9/11. We have lessons, that from 9/11 that impacted us on January 6th with the sharing of intelligence. My concern is we're going to have lessons learned on January 6th that are going to happen that are going to affect a future date if we don't do something about it and change. So I think first and foremost, making sure that everyone's clear on the intelligence, sharing the necessary intelligence, I think is a critical role. Law enforcement right now is walking on thin ice, or as they would say, they feel like they're walking on rice paper, because they don't feel like they have support from their city council, their various elected officials, members of the community. When you've got a small group that is probably causing a lot of problems for law enforcement, they're out there every day, regardless of your political position, regardless of race, gender, religious, sexual orientation, answering those calls for service. We need to support them, make them feel that what they're doing is a valued part of the community, because it is. A society without law and order is, a lawless society. So I think we need to support them a little bit more. And I think if people just start, abiding by the rule of the law and following their own directives, I think we'll be in a much better place.
And then what lesson can our political leaders learn?
I'd say probably one of the most important lessons. One, words matter. When you say stuff, watch out for the rhetoric, because people can take that and turn it into something that you didn't expect. So words matter, and also, if you're going to put people in leadership positions, whether it's to be a chief of police, or a chief of on Capitol Police, or whatever leadership position is, give them the authority to do their job, trust them, and don't have to hold purse strings, hold things over their heads. I know they recently passed a legislation that gave the chief of Capitol Police the authority in an emergency situation like what I faced on January 6th to go direct to the National Guard to request federal resources. And I applaud them for passing that. It's the Capitol Police Emergency Amendment Act of 2021. There's a couple important things. One, he can only do it in an emergency. So like when on January 3rd when I went and requested it, I don't believe it affects pre-planning. And two, they made it revocable. So that should tell you something. That leadership, they trust them to a certain point. They're ready to make it revocable and take that authority away from them when they feel it's appropriate.
Do you feel the Capitol needs more hardening, like a permanent fence or this quick reaction force that some people are talking about?
I hate to say it, the quick reaction force, I think that's a large sum of money to try and support that for a little benefit. I think, again, it all goes back to intelligence. This is something that we could have clearly seen with good intelligence, so that would have affected that. A fence, I think physical hardening, which the architect of the Capitol has testified to, you just like me, face budget constraints. I think that's your first and foremost. More physical hardening, better intelligence. A fence, it is the people's house. We'll see. There's a lot of officers that support a fence. I just feel bad that our society may be, pushing us in that position, in that direction.
And then last question, and what lesson can we as a society, as a country, learn from January 6th, including the social media companies and people who use social media and follow politics?
Don't be so quick to anger. The one thing I do talk about in my book, and I think it's one of the headings in my book, don't let your concerns for politicians and concerns for what's happening in your government force you into violence. Let it force you into action. Take a role in your political government. Take a role in who your leaders are, because if you don't, you're going to be led by fools. So that's your first and foremost. Rather than turning to violence or anything like that, whether it's the protests at the White House or January 6th, if you feel that strongly about it, get involved.
Chief Sund, thanks so much for joining us.
I appreciate it, sir. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to this week's Afterwards podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, listen to C-SPAN's podcast about books. Learn about the latest nonfiction books and best-selling authors. In each episode, we report on bestsellers lists and book reviews from around the country. You'll also hear authors talking about their latest books and insider interviews with nonfiction book publishing industry experts.